My name is Melissa Moore, and I'm Director of Education at the Figge, and it is very good to see you and connect with you all tonight for this exciting program. At the heart of all Figge programs is the belief that art has the power to transform lives, especially during times of crisis and uncertainty. We have held this belief near and dear as we have redefined what it looks like to fulfill our mission of bringing art and people together, even when we can't always be together in person. Many of our programs have been repackaged over the past few months. We hope you've enjoyed and continue to enjoy the assortment of offerings available through the Figge's virtual museum. As we can, we will begin to host modified programs in the museum, such as in-person small group classes like those that began this week. But for programs that need to accommodate larger groups of people, like our Thursday evening series, we're excited to host them online until we determine it is safe to conduct them in person at the museum once again. Trust me, we are as excited as you and as eager as you to pick up where we left off in March and start gathering together in person again. But until that time, please join us online as you are tonight and experience the transformative power of art as we continue to look, learn, and discover together in whatever form that takes. We are adding content to the Virtual Thursdays website every week, so check it often for up-to-date information and for registration options. And so you know, next week's program will feature the Figge Preparator and Assistant Registrar, Joshua Johnson, who will interview live online Dr. Jennifer Jankowskis, Curator of Art at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts, who curated the exhibition About Face, Contemporary Ceramic Sculpture, which is currently on view at the Figge. This program will start at 6:30 p.m. and just like this week, you will receive a link to join the program on the date of the program. We are able to offer these Thursday events at no cost to you thanks to the generous sponsorship provided by Chris and Mary Rayburn. So I just want to take a moment to thank you, Chris and Mary. We are all so grateful and appreciate this. Two quick notes about the program tonight. Since this program is hosted in a webinar format, you can type any questions you have for the speaker into the Q&A box or the chat, and we will try to address them as we can. I'll thank you in advance for your patience. It may be that we wait until the end of a section. We will get to your questions as quickly as we can, though. Also, I wanted to let you know that we are recording this session for archival purposes. So at this time, it is my great pleasure to turn things over to the Figge's Assistant Curator, Vanessa Sage, who will be introducing the program this evening. Vanessa, thanks so much for joining us.
Tonight's program features Didier William. It's related to the exhibition Didier William Lakou, which is at the Figge Art Museum through August 23rd. It is William's first solo museum exhibition and the first time his work has been exhibited in the Midwest. William is a Haitian-American artist who uses a variety of artistic techniques to create stunning artwork, thoughtfully examining his cultural identity, along with historical, mythological, and biographical elements. William's work has been featured in exhibitions at the Bronx Museum of Art, the Frost Museum in Miami, and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, among many others. He earned his BFA in painting from the Maryland Institute College of Art and his MFA in painting and printmaking from Yale University of Art.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you to the whole team at the Figge. The pandemic, of course, has forced us to have to figure out alternative means, but I just want to take a minute to acknowledge all of the not only hard work, but thoughtful work that you and your team put into this exhibition, which is chock full of such personal pieces for me that it means a lot to have such thoughtful and fantastic people stewarding the show. So thank you. That's the question of Miami is a good one, just because as some of you might know, I moved to Miami when I was 6 years old. My family immigrated from Haiti in 1990, August of 1990. My mom and oldest brother had moved a year prior, and started school and started the process of naturalization in the United States immigration process. And at the time, all of that was managed by the Office of Immigration and Naturalization Services, now known as Homeland Security, which I often like to sort of point that. I like to acknowledge that difference as a sort of a critical one. And, a lot of those early years were filled with me and my family trying to contend with the home that we left behind, and at the same time, appreciate the home that we were trying to build here in the United States, specifically in Miami, Florida, a neighborhood, an area that has the largest Haitian population outside of it. We initially moved to Miami because my mom's sister lived in Miami, and my mom's sister had been trying to get my mom to leave for years, and my mom sort of pushed back and resisted and waited and waited and waited, and once things got sort of rough enough, she decided that it was time for us to make the move. And those years were filled with a lot of negotiation, a lot of reflection on what we left behind, a lot of, on my part, I think a kind of a hurried, what I would retroactively describe as kind of a hurried frenzy to absorb all things American. I don't think I thought about it that way at the time. Of course, 6 years old, but reflecting on it, I think there definitely was a kind of angst about wanting to sort of familiarize myself with this new home as quickly as possible. And now, thinking about Miami as a kind of a diasporic space, Miami is kind of a secondary home. Miami as a kind of a maybe even a fictive or imaginary home. It figures quite largely into my work. I'm in the process of conceptualizing the next show, and I'm realizing that Miami sort of plays this role, this sort of anchoring role in my work, because we left Haiti when I was 6, and because I haven't been back since. My sort of conception of a fixed Haitian cultural nucleus really exists in Miami. It doesn't exist in Haiti because I left too young to really absorb any of those memories. That space remains historicized, it remains mythologized, it remains aestheticized in a very particular way, all of which I think is actually really sort of fertile and fruitful material to sit with, particularly within the context of diasporic identity formation. But in terms of like a space that I can call like a fixed home, or whatever approximation to fixity I can find, Miami really occupies that role, especially since my parents and my older brothers still live there. And so oftentimes when I'm drawing on these anecdotal narratives that come from very personal spaces, I'm thinking about that time spent in Miami. I'm thinking about those first couple of years spent learning English. I'm thinking about those first couple of years when my parents were trying to find work. My brothers and I were, becoming acculturated in school, uncomfortably, where all of us are trying to learn how to speak English. Those years figure largely because those years involve not only the most rapid amount of growth, but also the most sort of severe amount of negotiation. And that's a space that I find really, really potent in thinking about the capacity for those of us who sort of sit outside bounds of fixed cultural formations to really attempt to identify ourselves and to name ourselves and to claim our histories. And for me, Miami was that space as a young person. And like I said, admittedly, as an adult now, I'm going back to that moment and trying to think thoughtfully about the sort of hurried angst of that moment and slow it down and sort of stretch it out and really find the spaces in between and see what it really meant.
So my second question is, in Miami, when did you first start making art? And is there a specific moment that you started on that path to becoming an artist?
People always ask that, and I don't know if that's a specific moment, but I will say that I went to Little River Elementary School in Miami, which was a school that was maybe about 10, 15 minutes from our house. schools had told my mom that was a good school for us to go to because it was close to where we lived. And there was a professor there, a teacher there, by the name of Judy Williamson, who really sort of picked me out, me and a couple of friends out, and called our parents in for meetings and said, your kid is talented, he has skill, and there's this other school in South Miami that I think would serve him better, and that happened to be a magnet art school. And I didn't know what a magnet school was. My parents didn't know what a magnet school was. All they heard was, better education, and they said, absolutely, whatever we need to do. The school was an hour and a half south of where we lived, and because we lived so far north, we we're actually outside the county line. And my dad had to drive in the morning and drive me into the county line to get the northernmost bus stop so that I could then be bused to South Miami, which is about an hour and a half each way total distance. But they sort of completely supported me from the very beginning. And that was, I think, the first time where art became part of my daily life. Prior to that, I think it was a couple minutes here or there while I was in class at the river. But then in South Miami, there was 3 hours of the day dedicated to art. And then I went to South Miami Middle School, and again, there was 4 hours of the day dedicated to art. I went to New World School of Arts in Miami, which is a very competitive, very sort of prestigious visual and performing arts high school, right in the center of downtown Miami. And New World was the first time where I met other students, other kids who were just as serious, just as focused, and just as kind of like tunnel visioned about what they do. And it was broad. It wasn't just art. It was theater. It was music theater. It was dance. It was amazing. It was like I was surrounded by all these people who were so passionate about what they do, and it was kind of remarkable. And while I was in New World, I was blessed with some of those amazing teachers I've ever had, who kind of articulated a path towards a career as an artist, which again I never really thought about. New World was the first time where to recognize that this could be a life, this could be a fulfilling and potent life that could be sort of anchored in art making. And then from New World, I applied to a bunch of different colleges and ultimately decided to go to MICA. And then while I was at MICA, which was another kind of profound experience, I talked to some of my mentors, and although I didn't think I was ready, they felt like I was ready, and said that I needed to apply to graduate school and that I needed to apply to Yale. And so I applied to Yale and got an interview and got in. And Yale, of course, was a phenomenal experience. Both MICA and Yale were incredible places. They kind of took what I had and allowed me to sort of stretch it out and see all of its sort of connective tissue and expand on it, expand on the research potential, expand on the material potential, and really think through all of these ideas that I had and how to turn them into a much longer career as a productive artist. I hadn't really thought about any of that when I first said, I kind of want to be an artist. This might be interesting. But, if I have to, I must say that I think I was blessed with some really, really amazing teachers who kind of anchored me at every step and said, this vision, this passion, this process needs to be supported. And they knew where to point me to have that kind of support. At MICA, I think I really began to think about where the personal intersects with the historical, where the process might meet the symbolism. I hadn't thought about that in New World. New World was very much kind of technique-based. In some ways, kind of a boot camp, to be honest. I think those of us, and we're all still really close to this day, those of us who went to New World it was a kind of a college atmosphere for high school students. But it wasn't until I got to MICA that I started to take these courses that, as one does in college, um, that really helped me connect the dots in terms of, what I was thinking and the historical precedents for some of those ideas. Um, and when I got to Yale, that process continued and became even more rigorous and became even more thorough. And after Yale, as I think I mentioned before, I graduated in 2009, right at the beginning of the last recession. Oddly enough, we find ourselves in. And it was a really precarious moment to be leaving school. I think in hindsight, I actually feel sort of grateful for that time, just because it allowed me to slow down. It sort of removed the pressure of professionalizing my work for the gallery system prematurely. And I was able to kind of sit back and really experiment with material, not necessarily being worried that there was an audience I needed to fill, there was a market that I needed to produce for, there were shows I needed for. None of that was prescient. I started teaching after graduate school and got a studio, luckily at the time. Studios were relatively affordable. They immediately started to go up, of course. And I continued making work. Some of the investigations that I had begun in graduate school, I was able to continue while I was teaching. And it really gave me the time to kind of slow down and be a little bit more thoughtful about some of the ideas I was thinking, which I think they deserved. It really sort of shaped some of the ways in which I think about representation right up until this day. That was kind of a meandering answer.
It all sounded wonderful. That actually brings me to the next question, which is, you have been working more non-representatively, and then you shifted to more figurative work. Can you talk about that shift and how you view the relationship between abstraction and figuration in your current work?
That's a great question. So before graduate school, I was working representationally. During graduate school, I was working relatively representatively. And then right up until sort of the end, I started pulling away and beginning to introduce abstraction work. And after graduate school, I sort of made a left turn, worked almost completely non-representation. And again, I didn't think about it this way at the time. However, I think that moment was a moment where I could sort of slow down and think about process. Representation had always been sort of fraught terrain for me. Much like color, it felt like something that was so codified and clear, but the content I was referring to, being someone from another country, being a queer person growing up in a kind of multicultural milieu that is South Florida, not necessarily identifying with a particular sort of nationalized construction of blackness here in the United States. Blackness functions very differently in the Caribbean. All of these intersecting conditions that I wanted to be thoughtful about. I think prior to that work, I wasn't able to do so. It felt so transactional. And so when I stopped, or not necessarily stopped, paused explicit representation and moved into abstraction, where I felt like I was just thinking about material conditions. I was thinking about weight, gravity, surface, texture, all of those kind of physical, maybe even alchemical conditions that I don't know that I was aware of prior. That's what it afforded me, because I could jettison symbolism, I could jettison a particular kind of legibility and exchange it for something that was much more material and that was much more physical. And I love that. I didn't recognize it as a pause. I think at the time I thought, oh, work abstractly from this thought. But I really, really loved it, and I didn't know that I needed it, but I did. And one of the things I often like to talk about is that so often when we talk about representation, we refer to a kind of naturalized space that we're trying to represent or record or transmit. And in my mind, it's much more about a kind of a relationship to gravity, the thing that sort of binds us to this earth, the thing that allows us to recognize that we share space with one another, the thing that allows us to recognize that my body and your body are subject to the same rules and the same laws and the same conditions and the same pressures. Trying to negotiate that thing and trying to turn it into a kind of currency really became much more important for me when I sort of left representation and veered towards non-representation temporarily. I really became aware of the power of gravity in representing space, representing bodies. And more specifically, if I could jettison gravity, but keep the kind of physical, material, topographical condition, what could that allow me to do with representation? If I could keep all the other stuff but get rid of the sort of confines of a space that is defined by legible gravity, what could that allow me to do? And could that actually get closer to the kind of queer space or the kind of diasporic space that I'm talking about, that I want to talk about in the paintings? That's the number one sort of thing that working non-representationally for about, I think, 4 years really afforded me. And then now, a lot of those gestures that I used in that work, which was, a lot of pouring, a lot of staining, I was thinking about people like Helen Frankenthaler and Morris Lewis. A lot of those gestures are no longer poured, but cut paper, collage, and print have taken that role in my practice, which I'm incredibly thankful for, and I don't think I would have gotten to had it not been for that really critical segue.
Great, thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit more, or ask you a little bit more about your process from, how you come up with what the process is from idea to sketch to the finished work. How that works itself.
Yeah, totally. I make a lot of sketches. I'm usually always drawing. I'm drawing a little bit less these days because, as we talked about, I have a newborn. She doesn't care about me wanting to draw. But usually I'll just produce tons and tons of drawings. Oftentimes having a particular anecdote in mind, or a particular phrase in mind, or a particular moment in mind. And some of those drawings will turn into large-scale compositions for paintings. And then other drawings will turn into patterns for prints. And then other drawings might not turn into anything. But the prevalence of drawing, the importance of drawing, I think, was impressed upon me really early as a kind of thinking strategy. I think, again, I mentioned earlier that I was blessed and privileged with some really great teachers who really helped me understand that it's hard to process an idea when it's internal. You kind of got to get it out into the world and respond to it. One of the most important things I think one of my teachers told me was that you're the first viewer. You are the very first viewer of the work, and your reaction to it is as a viewer. And in that regard, you're sort of stepping outside of yourself as an author and stepping into your role as a viewer in order to move this line to the left, move that line to the right, move this line up, move this shape down. And in that way, I have to draw as often as possible in order to get these ideas to sort of sit in the same space that you and I occupy, so that I can recognize whether or not they fit, whether they're a little awkward, whether they need adjustment, whether they make a great painting, or they make a better pattern. All of those things kind of come into play immediately once I get the drawing out into the world. the work that is heavily patterned, those patterns usually happen in one of two ways. Either they're printed directly onto the panel, usually via a relief process, or they're etched or drawn into copper. Then that copper is printed, then that print is scanned and turned into a pattern, which turns into a screen print, which then gets collaged onto the panel. So those occur in one of two ways. The composition for the paintings are drawn into the paintings, then they are stained, usually in about 3 or 4 coats of heavy black stain, heavy black with stain or ink. And then the eyes are carved onto the panel. After the eyes are carved, the paint and collage is applied. Sometimes the paint might be applied prior. It just depends on how excited I am about which part of the painting, to be honest. So even this process that I'm outlining, I'm making it sound very sequential right now, but sometimes it sort of goes back and forth. It just depends on if I get an idea that I'm really excited about and I just want to start. Some days I'll be in the studio and there'll just be carving days, some will just be painting days, some will be printing days, some days I'll just decide I'm going to draw that day and just draw and not paint anything. Some days I might just go in and mix colors and make a bank of colors that I know we're going to be in the next painting. And I think some of that kind of layered process has definitely come from my printmaking training. When I started making prints, sort of late undergrad and into graduate school, I didn't think about it as a kind of a discrete process. I think for me, right from the very beginning, printmaking was always a tool for painting. And I think in part that's because of the people who I had as printmaking teachers. It was always framed as like a tool by which to arrive at painting. It wasn't until very recently, over the last like 3 or 5 years, that I've started making discrete prints. And so in many ways, the layered approach that I have to my paintings, these sort of sequential layers that come together but don't necessarily resolve comfortably, very much comes from printmaking.
Great. The next question I have is about your recent series, Broken Skies this year, and specifically the work that is in the exhibition at the Figge Art Museum, and that we are honored to have recently applied to the collection. I was wondering if you could speak to that series, and then also specifically to that work, and if there were any specific themes in the description of the series. You talked about some artists that saying the Turner that you were looking at. If there are any specific themes that you were looking at when creating that work?
No specific paintings, but I have, the Broken Sky series is one where I often will try to do this thing in the work where I collapse different temporal moments. And I was really thinking about Baroque landscapes from the early 1800s and this particular moment of the Haitian Revolution, and trying to think about what it would mean to sort of combine those two gestures. What it would mean to, in a sense, hijack the space in a Turner, hijack the space in a Burroughs, hijack the space in Cobesons. More specifically, not just the space, but specifically the skyscape, the clouds, and bring my figures, bring my bodies into direct conversation with those clouds, direct competition, maybe even with those clouds, and see what they do, how they interact with one another. And there were 3 paintings that preceded the one at the Figge, and they were both sort of grounded, or all 3 of them were grounded figures sort of engaging with a kind of solid space, engaging one another more directly. The one that the Figge acquired was one in which I wanted sort of complete suspension. I didn't want any, in a sense, I wanted the space to be dense, a space that even though it's ethereal, even though it's in the clouds, even though it's sort of borrowing this kind of Baroque skyscape. I still wanted it to be a quite dense space, so 90% of the composition is clouds. There's maybe a sliver of sky at the top that's in this sort of bright orange, but 90% of the composition is clouds, and then these figures sort of tumbling within those clouds, completely suspended within those clouds. And this idea of a kind of suspended gravity, or maybe a kind of a relief from gravity, I really see as the sort of pinnacle of liberation in many ways, and in some ways also the kind of pinnacle of a kind of queer space, a space that is unbound by that kind of gravitational pull. And then also, in thinking about much post-Enlightenment ideas around the body in relation to the landscape, the grandeur of the landscape, the sort of knowledge produced by that, I wanted to invert that relationship and really think, well, what would it mean if the body wasn't necessarily trumped by the landscape, but in kind of direct competition with the landscape, in a kind of an adversarial relationship with the sky. What would it mean if the sky was broken up into fragments that could be decomposed and recombined in alternative means? And so in a lot of those new pieces, you'll see these kind of Milky Way streaks that move throughout the composition that often look like the sky is being taken and sort of stippled. And I got really excited about that, not only as a way to sort of think about this dematerialization of the sky, but also to take the ornamentation, patterning, and fragmentation that was happening within the body and extend it throughout the rest of the composition. So every single element in the picture plane is made of these sort of particles that become exchangeable and become, in some ways, again, like I said earlier, a kind of currency. In my research around the revolution, that intimate relationship with geography and with land and with history is how my ancestors were able to sort of free themselves from the grips of colonization and defeat some of the world's most sort of elite, most armed forces. They had rudimentary tools, but they also had the brilliance that allowed them to really use the land to their benefit and win. And so trying to think about how all of that gets remapped in the historic imagination led me to the Broken Sky series, which I'm still continuing. The new body of work is a kind of a continuation of that thought process. Still, there's ample clouds all over the studio.
So recurring motif throughout your work is the eyes, the carved eyes. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the origins of that, as well as its significance to your work.
Sure. So the eye started, I think, about 2014 or 15. And there was one particular work where I was just coming, it was the first piece I made as I was coming back to the figure, back to the body. And it was a little portrait, and I had stained the wood at that time. I wasn't using ink and dyeing, whatever. I was using wood stain, the same wood stain that you would use to like stain a cabinet or something. And I was working in my bedroom. I didn't have a studio. I was living in Brooklyn. And I had carved the two primary eyes on the facade. And then for whatever reason, I continued carving. I think maybe out of curiosity, maybe out of boredom, maybe out of anxiety, maybe out of frustration. I just continued carving more and more eyes right up until about the base of the neck of the figure. And I realized that I had not only sort of removed, quite literally removed material from the surface of the wood panel. I had added something that wasn't there prior. I had added a level of empathy and confrontation that wasn't there prior. The body had been sort of reconfigured and sort of transformed away from this perfectly legible sort of traditional bust of a portrait to something that felt in some ways alien, but in some ways much more honest, much more present, and again, confrontational. And the eye as a motif in that moment became this thing that sort of evidenced the gaze, and more specifically, the circuitry of the gaze between I as a viewer and the subjects in my paintings. The backdrop of that was happening outside of my studio was the acquittal of Trayvon Martin. I'm sorry, the acquittal of George Zimmerman after he murdered Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida. And sort of witnessing what was happening in that trial, and witnessing what happened to Trayvon, and thinking about what that little boy would have needed to protect himself from Zimmerman's gaze. What kind of curiosity was he subject to that ultimately ended up costing him his life? And what would he have needed to keep himself safe from the gaze that Zimmerman put upon him that night? How would he have been able to return that gaze? What kind of armor would he have needed to return that gaze? Really helped me to start to think about what is the map that is formed around the body in the imagination. How much of that map has to do with history? How much of it has to do with sexuality? How much of it has to do with gender? How much of it has to do with racial formations? How much of it has to do with ideas about nationalism and tribalism? Where do all of those ideas come from, and how do we map them onto one another in a millisecond? And what does that look like if we could actually see that graphed? What would it look like? The eye as a motif became a stand-in for that. Became a kind of materialization or visualization of that, and of that process of bearing witness to that moment, that instantaneous moment where all of this really sophisticated information takes place. And I became obsessed. I became obsessed with carving eyes. And haven't sort of left them since as a kind of a way to sort of build the body. As you mentioned, I left the figure after graduate school and then have slowly started to sort of come back to the body ever since. And I think in some ways I'm rebuilding what the body that I imagine looks like. Traditional, conventional methods of restricting anatomy never seemed to work, even though I very much consider myself a pretty academic painter. A sort of academic approach to building a body never really felt like it made sense. It really felt honest. And so this way of remapping the figure since that painting, right up until the paintings I'm working on now, have been a much more sort of appropriate pathway to do that.
Thank you. The last question I wanted to ask is, so we're all navigating the shift of how we are living and relating to one another due to coronavirus. And I know we're in the midst of it, but I was wondering if the social, cultural, political issues and things that have risen to the surface have made you think about your practice or your work in a different way.
Tremendously. I mean, I feel like all of us are, right? All of us broadly as people and all artists too. This kind of disembodied engagement is not something that any of us are used to. And in some ways, I think this kind of disembodiment is something I've been thinking about sort of conceptually in my work. Existing outside of one's body as a queer person, as a means of survival. Existing outside of one's body as an immigrant, as a means of survival. What Jose Munoz calls disidentification. This way in which we're sort of forced to step outside of ourselves and separate our consciousness from a kind of embodied presence, again, as a means of survival, takes on a completely different turn when we're dealing with a global pandemic that threatens the lives of so many of us and has already taken the lives of so many of us. So, I'd be lying if I said it doesn't affect how I think about my work and how I think about my practice and how I think about, body things. I think this idea of thinking through how we compartmentalize and fragment methods of making ourselves present has become even more urgent to me. The sensibility and the touch of one body to another has become even more present to me. Realizing how much I miss hugging people has become so present on my mind. And thinking about what kind of exchange takes place in that moment, right? Like, in some ways, it's the exact opposite of what I'm talking about, this kind of imaginative construction that takes place when we see and sort of name one another as a kind of a gender or a race or an age, framing each other so that legibility is easy. The exact opposite of that is sort of leaning in and allowing our pulses to sort of meet each other, allowing our hearts to sort of meet each other. And that moment is exactly what we're missing right now, what we're denied of right now. And so I'm finding myself, I'm right in the middle of preparing for a show in the fall, and I'm finding myself rethinking all of the remaining paintings around this idea of forced disembodiment, and what are the potentials embedded in that? What does it allow? What does it disallow? What kinds of freedoms does it offer? What kinds of restrictions does it insist upon? What kind of new ways of engaging will it require? What is that going to do for how we think about gender, how we think about race, how we think about belonging? All ideas that I've been wrestling with for the last 15 years. So the short answer is yes, absolutely. It's affecting how I and all of my peers think about our work. The longer answer is, to be determined, right? And to see how it materializes. It's also really strange to be going through this as a new parent as well, and to sort of think about not only how my body moves through space, but how to protect another tinier body in space, and how to shield that body, how to feed that body. All of these things I think are so present on my mind in terms of how I think about the body in space, and how I think about the body in painting. I think, we're very much aware of the kind of fervor around figurative painting, representational painting right now. And in my mind, the role of the figure in painting has always been to do more than just transmit. I think representation can do a lot more than that. And that's always been my sort of prerequisite for how representation functions in my own work. And I imagine it will remain so and become much more complicated after this pandemic.
I just want to say thank you so much to Vanessa and Didier for doing that interview. And now we're going to transition from the recorded part of the program to a live Q&A with Didier. And of course, if you have any questions for Vanessa, who worked with him to curate the show, she will take those too. Thank you both in advance. And welcome, Didier. We're thrilled to have you on the program, and it's great to see you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you guys so much for having me. Happy to be here, and it feels like eons ago that Vanessa and I did that conversation. The world feels like a different place.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It was from a different time.
My beard is gone. My daughter is 3 months old. I'm like, oh my gosh, that feels like forever ago.
Oh, and you're still standing, not falling asleep with a 3-month-old. I think that's outstanding, and thank you even more so for taking the time tonight to be with us.
Thank you.
And congratulations. We're just so happy for you.
Thank you.
So for those of you who are listening to the program, as I said, we're transitioning to the live Q&A part. So if you have a question, I see some of you have already started to do this, please go ahead and type your question into the Q&A bubble. You will find that at the bottom of your screen, probably located toward the middle. You can also put it into the chat, and I will be monitoring that as will Vanessa. Didier, we are going to start with an easy one here. Can you tell us about your studio, including where it is?
Sure. So the background on my Zoom right now is actually my studio, even though I'm at home. But my studio is in Philadelphia, in Kensington, Fishtown, Philadelphia. I moved to Philly almost 4 years ago for a teaching position that I have since vacated, and I'm now at Rutgers University. But we loved Philly, and we loved the community here. We loved the art scene here. So we decided to stay, and I set up my studio in the Fishtown neighborhood, which is like an artsy, sort of eclectic neighborhood in the Crane Arts building. And I love it. Even, I've even taken my newborn there and gotten some work done with her sleeping in the Bjorn. It's a pretty amazing space. And I had been in New York for about almost 8 years. And New York was great and it served its purpose. But, like I said, about 4 years ago, we were ready for a change.
Well, I'm so glad that change has worked out for you. It sounds wonderful. Thank you. All right, so from one of our participants, Didier, you came to the USA when you were only 6, so you have lived the majority of your life here, yet your work clearly depicts a lot of culture, history, and the voodoo influence of Haiti. How do you keep your connection to your homeland? You have a lot of discussions with your elders about their life before they left Haiti?
That's a great, I kind of love that question, because I think it points to a sort of larger, not necessarily problem, but a larger concern amongst those of us who are immigrants. How do you stay connected to the place you left behind? And I think that negotiation changes and varies depending on what age you are when you come here. I was 6 years old, sort of right at that sort of precipice of becoming cognizant of who I was relative to the world around me when we moved. My brothers were 9 and 14, so they were a little bit more mature. But I was 6, and I was right at that moment where I was beginning to understand the world that I inhabited, and we came here. And so much of my understanding of Haiti has been adopted and absorbed from family who I understood to have a sort of quote unquote truer relationship to Haiti, and I put truer in air quotes, and sort of adopted and absorbed from them, as well as my own research, family research, and historical research. And then, my mom and dad telling me countless stories about, their own growing up in Haiti and their own relationships to the country. And my father being in Papa Doc's military, and my mom growing up in Miagwan and working for the American Embassy. And all of those things kind of encompassing the imaginary that makes up what I consider to be Haiti. But also considering that in tandem with like the material ephemera that we brought with us from Haiti. So those stories and that historical information in my mind sits right next to like the countless briefcases that are stacked under my parents' bed, all of which contain stuff that they brought from Haiti. And they've had this stuff since we moved here in 1989. Clothing, curtains, tablecloths, bed sheets. I mean, you name it. It's all in like these briefcases that they sort of packed with them, brought with them from Haiti. And that material ephemera, that material, that stuff, that physical stuff, sits in the imaginary at the same time as like, me researching the war on the border in 1937 that was exacted on Haitian farmers from the Dominican Republic. All of those things kind of become democratized in the diasporic imaginary when I, as an American, as a naturalized American, am trying to figure out what do I do with this stuff that's so much a part of my identity and so much a part of who I am, but that I invariably have a very distanced relationship from. Has a lot to do with how I've, come of age, but have a very distant and different relationship from than my brothers, even, who were just a little bit older than me, and certainly my parents, who lived through it. So yeah, to answer the questioner, it comes from stories with elders, namely my parents, but it also comes from kind of submitting myself to what I think to be a reality for all of us who move here from another country, which is that you can't, you have to sort of understand that some of what you consider to be yours is gone. There's a certain element of loss that we sort of submit to as immigrants, and that loss has to be filled with something. It has to be filled with information. It has to be filled with expression. It has to be filled with language, and that filling is what art has been able to do for me over the years. That filling that gap is what art has been able to do for me, and that's actually the space where I find my own subjectivity as a Haitian hyphen American. What do I fill that gap with? Because my parents are much older. They're not going to do it for me. My brothers have their own relationships to this country. They're not going to do it for me. I have to do it for myself, and that's really where my paintings come in.
Well, we're so glad for that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing all of that. And I just, when you said that the personal physical items sit in your imagination as you're navigating this, I think that's like so much of what you say and create, that's so poetic. So thank you for that.
And thank you. I mean, it's the truth. I'm thinking specifically when I was in high school, and on Sundays, my parents would leave for church in the morning, and I was the only one home. I would take that opportunity to go rifle under my parents' bed and look through these briefcases that were just filled with stuff, most often textiles that they brought with them. And they're still there. I could go to my parents' house today and still find the same briefcases. And some of those patterns and surfaces are the ones that are adorning my paintings right now.
Oh, I love that. Okay, so another question that is timely. Do you have any idea or thoughts on creating a piece of art that represents COVID-19?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's going to be hard for any of us to avoid COVID-19 in injecting itself into every part of our lives. Whether we are unfortunate enough to test positive for this thing or not, it's become part of all of our lives. And so I think in many ways, I'm already making work that deals with COVID-19. Myself and my friends who are also having kids this year, are playfully referring to our kids as the pandemic babies, the pandemic generation. So it's already injecting itself into our way of life, whether we test positive for this thing or not. So I feel less pressure to kind of account for it, and more pressure to think about, well, what does it require of me? What has it taken away, right? It's taken away our ability to be face to face. It's taken away our ability to share space with one another. It's taken away our ability to feel each other's bodies in the same room. It's taken away some of the physical evidences of presence that we relied on so heavily. I rather think about that and what that has to do with my paintings, rather than thinking about, how can I sort of forcefully insert COVID-19 into my paintings. That's less interesting to me. What's more interesting to me is to think about, well, what has COVID-19 done to us? And what do those things have to do with how I think about painting, how I think about the body, how I think about safety and presence, and materiality. And those are things that I'm certainly, absolutely thinking about. I mean, even before COVID-19, I was beginning to think about the eyes and how the eyes sort of materialize in my paintings, and how that same level of sort of fractal-like ornamentation pervades every other part of my work. And now we're thinking about those kinds of presences in the form of aerosols, and in the forms of droplets, and in the forms of these sort of biological conditions that extend beyond the body, that all of a sudden have become dangerous and nefarious. You know, it's now risky for our bodies to sort of extend beyond the singular, and that's sort of powerful and potent. And I want to sit with what that means for us in the long term, even after we've come up with a vaccine. How does that change how we think about one another? That's the kind of kernel that I think has a lot of potential.
Well, we all regret the cause, but we also look forward to seeing what comes next in your work, and how it does make its way in, as it is even now. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
We have another question from a participant. Tell us about the very colorful work that is directly behind you.
That one there.
I think so, yeah.
So that one is called Nanciella, which means in the sky. And I've begun, my next show is going to be in September of this year at James Fuentes Gallery and M&B Gallery in Los Angeles. And that body of work will have in it a series of cloud formations, many of which are borrowed from 19th century landscape paintings, from people like J.M.W. Turner and Burroughs and Alexander Cozens, landscape painters who were operating in Europe at the exact same time as the Haitian Revolution. And I'm curious about what it means to sort of remap the bodies of these degendered and deraced figures onto the imaginary spaces of these sort of masters of European painting, who were conceptualizing space that didn't include these stolen Black bodies from West Africa. In the diasporic imagination, I'm really sort of curious about what that means to kind of rethink and reconstitute the historical elements in that way, to take this part of the world and this part of the world and put them together and see what that does. Especially to have the bodies that I paint at my scale at the same scale as these sort of massive cloud formations. So this next show has 4 paintings that are that size, which is about, if I remember correctly, 65 by 102 inches. So slightly bigger than kind of a 1-to-1 body scale. And the bodies are at direct odds with these sort of massive cloud formations. And I'm wanting to sort of put those things together and see what they do in the space. My last show leveraged performativity on the stage, the kind of black box theater stage. This show leverages performativity in a sort of sci-fi, Afrofuturistic, almost Caribbean surrealism that borrows its motif from 19th century landscape painting.
Well, I think it's so much of, you mentioned scale, so much of that is what just grabs you as you enter into the Figge's gallery. And so for those of you who are on the program tonight but haven't seen it yet, you do have a little bit more time, and we hope you're able to get in some of the works that also are doing many of the same things. All right. So are you up for another one? Sure. How are you doing? Yeah.
I'm
okay.
Good.
Great. So the Figge, as you know, has a large collection of Haitian artwork. Did you find yourself drawn to any works in particular from the collection during your visit to the museum when you were installing the first visit?
Absolutely. When Vanessa and Andrew and I did the initial walkthrough, and Vanessa can attest to this, the first thing I was drawn to was the metalworks. I think even early on in my training, sculpture was a passion of mine. And when I went to graduate school, I actually thought about not graduate school, undergrad. I actually thought about double majoring as a painter and sculpture major. But I realized very quickly that I would have had to spend an extra year in school, and I decided not to. So it's interesting that now, like, 15 years later or something, my paintings are wood carvings, essentially, quite sculptural in their physical condition. So when I came to the Figge and we were conceptualizing the show, and Vanessa and Andrew showed me the incredible Haitian art collection at the Figge, the metalwork attracted me immediately, and we thought about doing something with sculpture and with 3D work. Time and resources got away from us. But that was immediately what kind of stuck out to me, and how I could not only sort of respond to the Figge's collection, but to also extend my work beyond the two-dimensional. I think one of the things I'm always been interested in is how to get two-dimensional painting to be physical, to be dimensional, to talk about movement, to talk about time. But to literally extend the body beyond the two-dimensional plane would have been really exciting. We had talked about that long kind of stairwell that you guys have, having figures crawling up that stairwell. But maybe we can plan for that for a different show.
Well, it's not my say, but it certainly sounds exciting. I'll leave that to you and Andrew and Vanessa. Okay, so this kind of builds on your answer about the intriguing spaces at the museum, as well as the metalworks that so caught your attention. Why were you interested in pursuing this exhibition at the Figge?
For a number of reasons. I think, now having been working for a while, I've been thinking a lot about how my work sits within a larger kind of conversation about Caribbean art, and more specifically about Haitian art. And of course, that means Haitian history and Haitian historical art. And the Figge has the largest, or one of the largest, collections of Haitian art in the country. So trying to situate my work within that trajectory was immediately exciting for me. The space is beautiful, the location is intriguing. Andrew and Vanessa were fantastic to work with, and you, Melissa, all of that stuff was amazing. But to also think about, this is an institution that has an encyclopedic collection of Haitian art, situating my practice within that felt really appropriate and powerful. And so right away it was a yes. And the timing was sort of perfect. I had just worked on a large show that spanned 2 galleries in New York, which I think is the show that Andrew saw. And so I had just had essentially 30 some odd paintings that were kind of dealing with personal and historical content anyway. So I had the work. The Figge's collection was sort of powerful. The moment felt right. It was around a time when, sort of as a country, the dialogue around what immigration offers to the American story was up for debate, as if it needed to be. And so that felt really appropriate. It was around the time that the man who occupies the White House was referring to my country as a shithole. So it felt really appropriate to kind of stake a claim into not only the large and powerful history of Haitian art, but also, to really stake a claim over Haiti's role within the American story. That felt right. All of the elements felt really appropriate. So it was a very easy yes on my part. Once Andrew and Vanessa offered the project, I was 100% in from the very beginning.
Well, we're so grateful for that, and also that it came together organically. We felt the same on our end too, so thank you. And thank you also for letting us extend it. I know that we had not anticipated the pandemic, and we're just devastated to think that people wouldn't be able to see it. And now there's an opportunity. So.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
All right. So does your role as an assistant professor of expanded print at Rutgers impact how you approach your practice? Or do you feel that the act of teaching others adds something to that artistic practice?
Oh, yes, and all the yeses. I mean, I think I didn't see the Rutgers position coming. Assistant professor of expanded print, and they were looking for a faculty member who thought about print interdisciplinarily, and thought about the graphic potential of print to sort of permeate other media. I was like, that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years. So that felt really organic. And then to think about how that can turn into a pedagogical practice felt like a really great challenge. So much of what I think about in my own work is how to sort of complicate these questions of representation and to diminish what I think is an artificial boundary between abstraction and representation, in its physical form and its conceptual form. And I happen to believe that printmaking does that best. I mean, I have brilliant colleagues, who happen to think that video does that best, or that photography does that best, or that sculpture does that best. And I love their work, and I encourage and support their practice. And I think that's why we work well together, because we have similar ideas about what kind of work we want the work to do. We just speak a different language. And so being challenged to do that with undergraduates and graduates on a regular basis, it's like going to the gym or something. It's sort of fine tuning those muscles as often as I can, in challenging students and provoking students to think in a complicated manner about those things as often as I can. And I think we're at a point where the stakes for that are really high. We're at a moment where, we sort of, on a guttural level, understand that there's something wrong with what we're doing, and we don't quite know what it is, and we can't quite put our finger on it. But the planet is literally telling us that we need to reevaluate. And I feel like it's right. It's ripe. The time is ripe to rethink what we mean when we talk about representation. Perhaps representation can do more than transmit. Perhaps representation has the potential to do more than that. And I happen to think printmaking does a really good job of that. And to be able to do that with students on a regular basis and to sit with their work is just a joy. It's an absolute joy. And not to mention, Mason Gross is just like, it's an incredible program with amazing colleagues, and just some of the best students I've ever worked with. I like to say that it's the best of all of the places that I've worked under one roof.
Well, I hope that we're all that lucky to experience that. I know we feel that way at the Figge. I'm so glad you feel that way, and I'm sure our participants have as well, hopefully now, but at least at some point in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so this is going to be the last question. Actually, we did have a question here, and it's not really a question so much as a comment, and it is Creole for thank you from Diana and Brian Lovett, but I almost don't want to even attempt it. I will anyway. So, merci un pile. How would you say?
Merci un pile.
Okay, yeah, so a big thank you from our participants. But before I pull Vanessa back in, just a final question. If you could pick one thing, and I know this isn't really fair, it's kind of hard. If you could pick one thing that you're most excited about moving forward, be it something that you're working on now, or something in your personal life, or just thinking about plans, what's the one thing that you're really just so excited about, gets you up every day?
Raising my daughter. I mean, maybe I'm cheating, but I have to say that. I've been thinking conceptually about all this work for so long, and it's surreal and amazing to not have like a fictional body in my studio that I'm thinking about, but have like an actual little person who is beginning to have thoughts and feelings and expressions, and to sort of introduce her to the work, and to see what she thinks of it, to see how she thinks about it, to explain it to her. It's seeing how that sort of plays out. The thing that I'm most proud of producing before her was my work, giving birth to 20 or so paintings a year, and having those paintings live out in the world and be fodder for ideas was exciting. But now, having given birth to a little person who may or may not agree with me is even more exciting.
You say that now, but as somebody who has a teenager upstairs, I think, yeah, we'll check back with you in a decade or
You're
so.
like, you're gonna regret that.
No, it's all an amazing experience. So, just takes different forms. All right, well, thank you so much for joining us, Vanessa. Is there anything you wanted to hop in and say? First of all, I want to thank you, Vanessa, for organizing this and for doing the interview.
I just wanted to reiterate thank you to Didier, and it's been a wonderful experience on our end as well. The exhibition is up through August 23rd, and we also have a fantastic catalog with essays by Dr. Jerry Figge, as well as Edouard Duval-Perrier, and that's available in the store as well as through the website. So I would encourage everyone to come into the museum to see the exhibition, but also to get that catalog as well.
Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Andrew. This has been and continues to be such a special show, even with the COVID interruption. This project was so exciting for me, and I feel like it came at the right time, and I couldn't be happier and prouder to have my work at such a phenomenal institution. Thank you guys so much. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, again, thank you. We feel the same times 10. And thank you also for your time tonight. I know that we're living in turbulent times, and with your daughter, especially being as young as she is, every minute that you give is something we truly appreciate.
Thank you, guys.
So I'm going to just do a little wrap up here. I also wanted to thank all of our participants who are on the webinar tonight. We did just last week start up these these virtual Thursday programs, and we're going to keep doing them for as long as we need to before we can all gather together again in person at the museum and experience this. So we hope to see you frequently at the programs. We're posting them weekly on the Figge's website, so please do check those out. And also, if you're interested in visiting the museum but haven't yet, we encourage you to go to the website and check out some of the policies that we have in place just to ensure that you have a safe and enjoyable experience at the museum. We also strongly encourage registration. So if you have any trouble with that, you can give us a call or email us, and we will help you with that. It's not required, but it's strongly recommended, again, just to make sure that we can help you have a safe and wonderful experience as you revisit your new and old friends on display at the museum. So thank you again, Didier. Thank you, Vanessa. And thank you to the rest of the team for making this happen. We hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.